He didn't wake up one day and decide to become a criminal. That's the lie people tell themselves because it's comforting, because it makes what came next feel impossible, accidental, a wrong turn instead of a deliberate road. Ryan Wedding's life didn't collapse. It expanded, fast, flashy, and violently out of control. And for years, it looked like success. Long before the FBI, before the murders, before his name landed on the 10 most wanted list, and before his arrest this past week sent shockwaves through both the sports and crime worlds, Ryan Wedding was already living large, quietly, selectively, with the kind of luxury that doesn't beg for attention but assumes it. The kind you don't question because the resume checks out. Olympian, real estate investor, and former national hero. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. By the mid-2000s, Wedding's lifestyle had outgrown anything his legitimate income could explain. He wasn't just living comfortably, he was living expensively, and more importantly, confidently, the way people do when they believe the money will never stop. High-ceiling condos and exclusive developments, custom gaming setups with racing seats and multi-screen rigs, snowmobiles parked next to superbikes, a Ducati, a BMW M5. These were not leased or borrowed but owned. This wasn't reckless spending, it was curated, designed to project control. Friends noticed the shift before authorities ever did. The quiet kid who didn't care about status was suddenly wearing Prada shoes, flashing Breitling watches, and moving through rooms like someone who knew he mattered. Not celebrity confidence, something colder, something harder, the confidence of someone with leverage. And while the public still saw an Olympian finding his footing after Salt Lake City, behind the scenes, Wedding was learning a different sport entirely. One with higher stakes, better margins, and no medals, only consequences. Vancouver at the time was changing, fast. The city sat just miles from one of the longest unprotected borders in North America, and the math was simple. Marijuana that sold for a few $1,000s in British Columbia could double in value across the US border. The risk was real, but so were the profits. And where money moves fast, violence follows. Nightclubs became battlegrounds, parking lots turned chaotic, and bouncers wore bulletproof vests. Ryan Wedding didn't. He told his mother he wasn't scared. That wasn't bravado, it was curiosity. Working as a bouncer wasn't about the paycheck, it was about proximity. He met people he was supposed to keep out. People with connections. People who didn't talk loudly but always seemed to have cash. People who treated risk like currency. And then came real estate. A $250,000 loan from his father turned into a house flip in Maple Ridge. The profit funded a new apartment in Westwood Plateau, luxury finishes, high ceilings, toys that screamed disposable income. To outsiders, it looked like a former Olympian reinventing himself. But even that money didn't stretch far enough. So Ryan Wedding did what ambitious people always do when legitimate paths feel too slow. He optimized. The grow operation at 18 Karat Farms wasn't sloppy. It wasn't small. It was industrial. Thousands of cannabis plants. Guns locked in safes. Tens of millions in potential value. It was a business, not a side hustle, and Wedding treated it like one. Twice a month he showed up, checked operations, moved product, delivered to suppliers, quiet, efficient, detached. When the RCMP raided the property in 2006 and found nearly 7,000 plants and massive quantities of processed marijuana, the system failed to do the one thing that might have stopped everything that came next. They didn't charge him, and that moment mattered, because nothing reinforces belief like getting away with it. By the time Ryan Wedding connected with Hassan Sharini and learned about the Hawala network, his thinking had already shifted beyond Canada. Hawala wasn't just a money transfer system, it was freedom. No banks, no paper trail, just trust, codes, and invisible movement across borders. That's when the ambition scaled. Cocaine wasn't a leap, it was a progression. By 2007, Wedding was bleeding money from bad deals and lost investments. But instead of pulling back, he doubled down. Bigger buys, bigger partners, bigger risks. 24 kilos wasn't a test run, it was a statement. When he landed in California in 2008, the FBI noticed immediately, not because he looked dangerous, but because he looked comfortable. Too comfortable for someone touching that volume for the first time. He acted like a tourist, shopped, ate out, hit hookah lounges, picked up cash from a Persian rug store like it was normal. And that's what struck agents later. He didn't behave like a desperate man. He behaved like someone who thought he was untouchable. The arrest should have been the end. The conviction should have been the lesson. Instead, prison became training. At the Metropolitan Correctional Center in San Diego, Ryan Wedding didn't shrink. He observed, networked, learned, built relationships with people who didn't need introductions, people who understood logistics, routes, enforcement gaps, and how violence functioned as a business tool. By the time he stood in court asking for leniency, telling the judge this was out of character, he wasn't lying. It was out of character. The problem was that he'd already found a new one. When Wedding returned to Canada, bankrupt on paper and unemployed by his own sworn statement, the luxury didn't disappear. It just went underground. Gated condos, new vehicles, quiet living, and then he vanished. By the time law enforcement realized what he had become, Ryan Wedding was no longer an ex-Olympian with criminal ambitions. He was a kingpin in motion, and the luxury lifestyle he once flaunted? That was just the warm-up. By then, the line had already been crossed so many times it no longer looked like a line at all. It looked like a system. Because once Ryan Wedding disappeared from public view, he didn't retreat, he restructured. The flashy purchases stopped. The visible luxury faded. What replaced it was far more dangerous: insulation. He stopped being the face. He became the architect. Authorities would later piece it together in fragments: wire transfers here, encrypted messages there, sudden cash movements that never touched a bank. Wedding wasn't just moving product anymore. He was moving people, orders, fear. And that's when the violence escalated. Not impulsive violence, not bar fights or street chaos. Targeted violence, the kind designed to send messages without leaving fingerprints. People who crossed him didn't argue. They disappeared. Competitors weren't warned, they were erased. Associates who talked too much didn't get second chances. This wasn't rage, it was management. Investigators believe Wedding operated with a small, trusted inner circle. Men who understood that loyalty wasn't rewarded with praise, but with survival. Everyone else was expendable, useful until they weren't. And through it all, he stayed invisible. No social media, no nightlife photos, no public disputes, just whispers. By the time law enforcement agencies across borders realized they weren't chasing a disgraced athlete anymore, but a coordinator with international reach, it was already too late to stop the momentum. The money was flowing faster than ever. Cocaine routes stretched from South America through Mexico, across the US, and back into Canada. Marijuana profits were laundered through shell companies and informal networks that left no paper trail. Wedding didn't need to be present. He didn't need to give orders directly. He built redundancy. If one route collapsed, another opened. If one lieutenant fell, another stepped in. If one country tightened enforcement, operations shifted overnight. This wasn't luck. It was planning. And the most chilling detail? He learned it all after prison. The man who once stood before a judge promising reform came out sharper, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. Prison didn't scare him straight. It showed him scale. It taught him patience. It introduced him to people who thought in decades, not weeks. By the early 2000s, his name barely appeared in public records at all. That absence wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. While others fought for territory loudly, Wedding operated like a ghost. Until the bodies started forcing attention. Murders linked to his network didn't happen in emotional bursts. They happened when money was threatened, when shipments vanished, when silence broke. And suddenly, the story changed. This wasn't about a fallen Olympian anymore. It was about a criminal enterprise that had outgrown its origin story. The FBI began coordinating with Canadian authorities. Intelligence files thickened, surveillance tightened, but every move seemed reactive, always one step behind. What finally brought Ryan Wedding down wasn't a dramatic raid on a snowy mountaintop hideout or a car chase straight out of a Hollywood thriller. It was relentless pressure, international coordination, and time catching up to a man who had spent over a decade evading justice. After years on the run, Wedding is now in custody, and the end of his decade-long flight from law enforcement has unfolded in a way that's every bit as compelling and chilling as the rise that preceded it. Here's how it all happened. In January 2026, after years on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, Ryan Wedding's isolation finally broke. Federal and Mexican authorities located him in Mexico City, where he had been believed to be living for well over a decade, under assumed identities and cartel protection as he built his alleged drug trafficking empire. According to US officials, the arrest occurred on the night of January 22, 2026. Wedding was taken into custody in Mexico, reportedly still tied to powerful cartel networks, and then flown to the United States shortly after to face the sweeping federal indictments against him. At the official announcement in Ontario, California, FBI Director Kash Patel didn't mince words. He labeled Wedding a modern-day El Chapo, comparing the former Olympian turned fugitive to some of the most notorious drug lords in history. Investigators say Wedding's organization shipped tons of cocaine from Colombia through Mexico and into Southern California and Canada, and allegedly orchestrated multiple murders in furtherance of those operations. But it wasn't simply a dramatic takedown by force. Reports from the arrest also noted that Mexican authorities initially claimed Ryan Wedding had surrendered at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, a statement meant to emphasize cooperation across borders and respect for diplomatic norms. However, Wedding's lawyer, Anthony Colombo, later publicly disputed that claim, stressing that his client was apprehended, not voluntarily surrendered, and that reports of an embassy surrender were inaccurate. This distinction matters. It underscores how careful and strategic Wedding had been in his final years of freedom, not openly turning himself in, but instead being forced into custody by a coordinated law enforcement effort that ultimately cornered him. Within days of his return to U.S. soil, Wedding made his first federal court appearance in Orange County, California, where he pleaded not guilty to the sprawling indictments against him. According to court reporting, he was brought before a federal judge in a tan detention uniform with an orange undershirt, appearing calm, even somewhat detached, as if the outcome had been inevitable. Those indictments are massive. They span numerous felony charges, from drug trafficking on a global scale to murder and witness intimidation, and to money laundering and conspiracy offenses authorities describe as part of a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. Prosecutors allege Wedding's network once moved 60 metric tons of cocaine annually, funneling illicit product through Los Angeles distribution hubs and beyond. The courtroom moment was surreal to many observers. The man who'd stood on Olympic snow in Salt Lake City, once a symbol of athletic discipline and national pride, now sat under courtroom lights, facing justice for what the Department of Justice has described as some of the most violent and extensive narcotics offenses in recent memory. Wedding's legal team did not ask for bail at the initial hearing, and the judge agreed that the seriousness of the charges and the flight risk he posed meant he should remain detained without bail. With trials scheduled to start this spring, the coming months will unfold one of the most extraordinary legal sagas in recent criminal history. So what does this mean, legally, culturally, and historically? For law enforcement, Wedding's capture marks a major victory in the global fight against organized drug trafficking. It's the culmination of years of joint efforts by agencies across the United States, Mexico, Canada, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. Over time, the FBI's Operation Giant Slalom led to numerous arrests, the seizure of massive quantities of cocaine, and the disruption of the supply lines that sustained Wedding's empire. For victims, families like those tragically affected by violence linked to the trafficking network, there's a painful sense of closure emerging, even as justice has only just begun. Authorities revealed that Wedding is allegedly connected to the killings of multiple people, including some whose deaths drew national attention due to their senseless, brutal nature. For the public and the media, the optics remain almost unfathomable. A former Olympian, someone who once embodied discipline and elite achievement, reduced to a decades-long embodiment of crime at the highest levels. The very contradictions in Wedding's life, athlete versus outlaw, disciplined competitor versus alleged kingpin, have made his story one of the most covered criminal narratives of the decade. And for Wedding himself, this moment, the moment he finally answered to the full weight of the justice system, represents the end of a long, winding, and dangerous path he chose long ago. Whether in a courtroom, a prison, or decades from now in historical texts, Ryan Wedding's capture will likely be remembered not just for the sensational headlines and the international manhunt, but for the deeper lesson it illustrates: no one outruns accountability forever. And in a world still grappling with the reach of transnational criminal networks, the former snowboarder's fall from grace stands as a stark reminder: for glory and infamy, the line can sometimes start out invisible, but in the end, it always catches up.